In the previous videos we looked at installing the template and customizing our character, and at the end of the last video the last thing we did was pre-render our animation library. So you can see now that in the template, now the render's finished, that both the animation library and the shadows library both have this little square next to them, and that means that the proxy has been enabled. So if I untick this, the proxy is disabled, and I can remove the proxy if I want. So I go to set proxy, I can say none, so I can go back then and edit my character. But if I want to put the proxy back on and I want the template to run faster, then I can go to set proxy, file, and I can go to where the file was rendered before, and I can just hit import. So I'm going to close part A now and load up part B, and the first thing you'll see is this animation library preview, and if you double click that one, you can see you've got a comp that has every single clip all running in sequence with the names underneath. So you can use this to check that your pre-render is rendered correctly, because you should be able to scrub through it nice and fast, and you can use it to figure out which clips you might want to use because the names are underneath each one. Okay, so we're ready now to create our first animation sequence. So I'm going to open up the animation sequence folder. An animation sequence is simply a collection of clips, cycles and transitions all connected together. So you can see these blank sequence comps I've got here. If I was to open one of these up, it's just a really long comp, so it's this shape, so we can actually move the character left and right across the screen. And you can see in a blank sequence we've got a camera, and we've got this null, which is the initial start position. So if I look at this folder here, I've got sequences from example scenes. So this has got all of the sequences that have already been made in the template. And you can see if we scroll down that we've got one called all clips workout example. And if I was to open that one up, you can see here that it contains all of the clips in the project, all sequenced together. So again, that can give you an idea of how things might connect up. So I'm going to create a new animation sequence, and I'll do that by duplicating one of the blank ones, and I'll give it a name. And I'll open that one up. So I'm ready to start adding some animation to this sequence. So if I go back to the animation library and I look inside, we've got these three folders that correspond to the three different characters, and I'm going to use character 1 because that's the one we rendered out earlier. So he's got three folders here. He's got clips, cycles and transitions. So I want him to run in from screen left to screen right, so I'm going to go to the cycles folder and I'm going to find the run screen right cycle. I'm just going to drag that into the sequence. So if you see, if I scroll through here, our character is running on the spot. I want him to run a few more steps, so I'll put a few more of these in. And I'm going to hold shift and drag these so they sit flush with each other, so the ends connect up. So if I scroll through now, you can see we've got these multiple steps. Now the next thing I want is for the character to come to a stop. So I'm going to go in the transitions folder and I'm going to look for run screen right to stop. And I'll drag that on and I'll hold shift again to snap it to the end. You can see our character comes to a stop. And the last thing I'm going to add on here is some idle time at the end. So if we go into the clips folder and find clip 1, idle focused, drag that on, hold shift and snap that to the end. Now the reason we pre-rendered the shadows and the characters separately is so that we can keep this shadow on the ground, so we can keep this separate from the character if we want to include any other 3D elements. So to keep him 3D throughout the whole thing, I'm going to enable the 3D layer checkbox for each layer. And I'm also going to enable the collapse transform. So at the moment, if I scrub through, you can see that the character is just running on the spot, and that might be okay for what you need to use it for. But in this case, I want my character to run left to right across the screen. So if I go to the animation presets folder and open up the We Are Humans, then you can see we've got this folder called character motion. So I'm going to drop that open. And inside we've got folders for clips, cycles and transitions. So each animation that has left to right motion in it is going to have its own preset. And then we've got this default preset for clips that don't move left to right. So let's start adding on this motion. So I'm going to go back to the first frame of the first one I want to add motion to, so that's cycle 3. I'm going to open up the cycles folder, find cycle 3, and just drag that onto the clip. So now when I scrub through, you can see he's running across the screen. Just going to zoom out a little bit. So you can see when we get to this next cycle that he jumps back to the spot again. So I'm going to hold shift and I'm going to snap to the start of this next one. And I'm going to drag on the same preset for this. I'm going to do the same for the next run. So you can see our character's already running off the screen. So we could, before we started this, we could have started a new, even bigger comp. We could change the size of it. But I'm going to use this initial start position to pull him left. So if I go to the transform options for this and use the X position, I'm just going to drag him so he starts over this side. Okay, so I'm going to add the presets for the run right to stop. I'm going to hold shift and snap to the start of the clip. Open up the transitions folder, find transition 8, I'll drop that on there. And then for this last one, you can see when I get to the idle, he jumps back again. So I'm going to want to connect this too. So I'll shift drag, snap to the start of the clip, and I'm going to go to clips. And we've got this default no motion one here. So any clip that doesn't move, we can add that default one on. Okay, so that's our first sequence. Next thing we're going to do is create a scene to drop this sequence into. So a scene's a container for any number of sequences or any other elements that you want to add. So I'm going to close this animation library folder for now. I'll close the anim sequences and I'm going to load up the scenes folder. So again, we've got these blank scene compositions, and if I open one of these up, you can see we've got this 1080p comp, we've got a 3D camera, we've got a guide layer for where the floor level is, and then we've just got a background color. So I'm going to create a new scene again by duplicating one of these. Hit Ctrl D, and I'm going to rename this. And if I open this up, the next thing I'm going to do is add our sequence to this scene. So if we load up the animation sequences folder, select our sequence, and just drag it in. We want to make sure it goes above the background solid, and we'll put it on top of the floor. So if I drop it in between the camera and the floor, and I scrub through, you can see our character is running across the screen. Again, because we want to keep the shadow 3D, we're going to enable the 3D layer for this guy, and we're going to keep the collapse transforms on. I think he's a bit big in this comp, so we could either scale this sequence down, but in this case I'm just going to pull the camera away slightly. So I go to the Z position of the camera, just reduce it a bit. And the same thing, if I wanted to frame over more screen right, then I could take the camera and change the X position until we find where our character has stopped. I'm just going to slip the layer slightly so that he runs in straight away. So if I grab this and pull it back in time, so at the very start of our scene he's running in. The next thing we're going to look at is the motion graphics elements. So if I close the animation sequences and the scenes folder, I'm going to open up the motion graphics elements folder. And you can see we've got subfolders for the different types of motion graphics elements that are available. The first thing we're going to do is add some text to our scene. So if I open up the text folder, first thing you'll see is this all presets together example. And if I open this up, you can see this has got all of the presets that are available all in one comp, so you can just decide which one it is you want to use. I'm going to open up this new text folder. We've got a composition for each type of text, so if I load up the bold one, or a paragraph, in this case I'm going to open up the headings folder, and I'm just going to choose heading 1, and I'm going to make a duplicate of that, and I'm just going to call it demo text. And if I open up this new one now, I'm going to put the words demo scene in there. And you can see when I move this text around that the background bubble is going to follow it, so I'm just going to reposition it slightly. And I'm going to manually just move this little tail into place so it fits. So if I go back to my scene and I drag this demo text layer on, I'm going to make this 3D as well. If I zoom out, I should be able to see the text is over here. So I'm just going to move that back in. And because that's 3D, I'm going to push that back behind the character and scale it up. So I'm going to move things around a bit here. I'm going to reposition the camera again slightly, move our character over. The next thing we're going to add is a glyph. So if we open up the glyphs folder, we've got this composition that shows all the glyphs that are available. So I can scrub through this and decide which one I want to use. In this case, I'm going to pick this heart. So if I drop open the symbols folder in this case, I'm just going to double click this to open it. Then we've got this one layer inside the glyph, and that's the glyph selector. So if I select this and go to the effects controls for it, then you can see we've got a drop down box where we can choose which one we want. So I'm going to go down to the heart and select that, and then I'm going to change the colour, so I'm just going to make it grey. Now if I go back to my scene again, and I'm going to drag on this composition, I'm going to put this in the background. Now if I make this 3D again and I collapse the transforms, that means we're going to be able to scale this up as big as we want without losing any quality. So if I go to the scale options, and I'm going to reposition that behind our character. I'm going to set the opacity down a bit on this as well. Just go back to my text layer, I'm going to scale that down a bit as well. Okay, the next thing we're going to add is an icon. So if I open up the icons folder, then again we've got this composition that shows all the icons. And if I just scroll through here, we can see the ones that are available. So I'm going to use this bowling image again. So if I scroll down here and find the one I want, bowling, and go back to my scene and drag that icon on. And again, I'm going to make this one 3D. So I zoom out again, and drag it on. I'm going to push this back so it's behind our text. And I'm going to scale up a bit. So now we've got all the elements arranged in our scene the way we like. I'm just going to turn off the floor layer for now. We can add some motion presets to actually give a bit of movement to these elements in the scene. So I'm going to start with the text, and I'm going to go back to my effects and presets panel and close the character motion folder and open up the motion graphics folder. You can see we've got presets to bring elements in and to take elements out of the scene. So in this case, I want my text to come in from the right, so I'm going to use the in slide left, and I'm going to choose the time when I want that to happen. So I'm going to do it just as my character is running in, and I'll drag that onto the demo text. So now when I scrub through, the text should come on. I'm going to do the same for the heart in the background. And I'm going to have that one scale in. So if I choose in, scale, then I've got this option here for rasterize layers. Because this has its collapse transform enabled, I'm going to use the rasterize layers option. You can see it scales in. I think that's happening a bit late, so if I drop that open and I go to the effects section, then you can see there's the transform effect that I just added, and I can take the keyframes and I can just drag them so they happen earlier. And for the bowling ball, I'm going to have that slide in from the bottom. So if I go to in, slide up, and drag that onto the bowling ball. And the good thing about the way that the effects get added as transform effects means that we can actually reposition these layers. We can just put them where we want, and the effect will still stay on top. So you can see that the bowling ball still slides in from the bottom, even though I've moved it over there. So let's put that back where it was. As well as bringing things into the scene, we can also use the motion graphics presets to take them out. So I'm going to fade out the words demo scene. I'm just going to fade them out here. So if I scroll down the list, then I find out, fade out, and I drag that onto our demo text layer. Then as I scroll along there, fades out. Now let's say we want to add some more animation on. So at the end of this sequence of animation, we want our character to start talking. And we can go back to our sequence. And at the end, we can start adding more clips. So I'm going to close the motion graphics elements and load up the animation library again. And we're going to have our character start to talk. So I'll go to the transitions folder and I'll use to talking with gestures. Drag that on, hold shift again, snap it into position. And I'm going to put on transition 10, which is the character stopping talking. So I'll put that on underneath and put that in position as well. So you can see when I scrub through here, the character's jumping back to the spot again. So we need to add the preset, the character motion default no motion preset. So I drag that onto both of those. And the last thing we need to do is make both of these 3D and select the collapse transforms on both of them. So if we go back to our scene now, you can see that our character is starting to talk. Because our character's talking, we're going to add another text preset. We're going to put a speech bubble on. So if I close the animation library again and open up the motion graphics elements, I go back to the text folder, and you can see at the bottom we've got this preset called speech bubble. So I'm going to duplicate this and rename it. And I'm going to open this up. You can see we've got this text box layer, and if I move that around, the bubble behind is going to follow it. And also, if I use the text tool and I select inside, and I change the size of the text box, the text is going to fit inside the box, and then the bubble is going to rearrange itself. And you can also see that if I scrub through this composition, that the text comes on word by word. So I'm going to put some new text in here. And because our character is going to be talking from this side of the speech bubble, I'm just going to take this speech bubble tail. I'm going to go scale it and -100. So I'm just going to mirror it and position it over here. Now if we wanted to change the speed that the text was coming on, we can open up this speech bubble text guide layer and drop it open until we find this range selector. And you can see we've got two keyframes here, and they just represent the start and the end. So you can pull that out to make it faster or slower. I'm going to go back to our scene again and drag this in. I'm going to make it a 3D layer, and let me just zoom out again so I can grab it. I'll position it by our character's mouth. And let's have the words start appearing when he opens his mouth. So I'm going to just drag this in time a bit later. And I'm going to push it back in depth so it's behind our character. And scale it up a little bit. So we're going to use an animation preset on this too. We're going to have this scale in. So if I go to the effects and presets, open up the motion graphics, and I'm going to use in scale for 2D or 3D layers, and I'm going to drag that onto our speech bubble. So we can see the speech bubble scaling in now. And if we want to scale it in from this point here, what we can do is grab the anchor point and reposition it so that the anchor point sits on the speech bubble tail. So now when I scale it, it's scaling in from that side. Okay, I'm going to add one last bit of animation to this character. I'm going to have him run out screen right. So I'll go back to my sequence again. And I'll go back to the animation library, and I want him to run screen right. If I drag that on, hold shift to snap it. And then we're going to add the transition preset on there as well. So that's transition 6. Make that 3D, and I'll collapse the transforms on it too. So our character runs off. Go back to our scene. Check he's running out of screen. And I'm just going to fade the speech bubble. So if I choose out, fade out. you want, you can enable motion blur for these motion graphics elements. So I'm just going to hit the motion blur button, and for the things I want to blur, like the text, the speech bubble, the icon, I can enable the motion blur flag here, and then in the settings I'm just going to reduce the motion blur a little bit. I'm going to change the shutter angle to 90. Okay, so now we're happy with our scene. We can combine this with another scene to make a story. So I'm going to open up the story folder, and again you can see we've got these blank compositions. So if I open up one of these, this is literally just a container, so it's just a blank HD composition. So if I duplicate one of them and rename it, call it demo story, and I'll open this up, then we can go to our scenes and we can find the scene that we made and just drag that on. And you can see that our scene composition is taking up the whole story composition at the moment, so I'm going to go back to the scene and I'm going to set this work area to the end of the scene. And trim the composition. So I'll go to composition and trim comp to work area. So I go back to my story now. We can see it's a bit more of a sensible length. I've got another scene that I made previously, so I'm going to add that as well. And I'm going to position this on top. And now I've got my two different scenes. I can create a transition between the two of them. So I've got a bit of overlap here with my second scene on top of the first one. I can go to the scene transitions and I'm going to use a left to right wipe, and if I drag that onto the scene on top, and I'm just going to move that across a little bit. Then you can see that we transition from one scene to the next. So that's it. I can set my work area for this story. Hold shift to snap it. I go to composition and trim the work area again. Okay, so now we're happy with that. We're ready to add it to the render queue. So if I go to composition, add to render queue, I'm going to click on lossless by the output module. I'm going to change this from an AVI to a QuickTime, and because it's lots of flat color, I'm going to change it to pin compression. That means we're not going to lose any quality, but we're going to get a smaller file size. Hit OK. And I hit OK on that. So there's one important setting that's really going to affect how long it takes your compositions to render, and that's in the render settings. If we click on best settings, by default it's set to use no proxies, so it will remove the pre-render that you created for your character at render time. So we can force it to actually use those pre-renders and speed things up a bit. I can say use all proxies and hit OK. I can choose where I want it to render to, and then just hit render, and that's it.